Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with another mini lecture on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. This one is on the status of women as property. So, last mini lecture, I was telling you about Kirby Farrell's theory that Romeo and Juliet's suicides are a failed rebellion taking the form of self-punishment on behalf of an internalized father. I suppose that might be a hard idea to get your head around, but it can be illustrated pretty well from the Harry Potter books. The idea, you recall, is that rebellious impulses may be directed outward, as when they are channeled into the blood feud, or redirected inward, where they take the form of guilt. There's a vivid example of such internalization in the Harry Potter characters known as house elves. The house elf is a servant who identifies completely with his master. His worshipful self-effacement is carried so far that he never uses the first-person pronoun. Dobby can't say I. Instead, he refers to himself as Dobby, speaking of himself only from the master's point of view. This internalized loyalty to the master not only erases Dobby's sense of his own independence, it also punishes him for any disloyal or disobedient thought, forcing him to beat his head against the wall, slam his fingers in the door, or otherwise injure himself.
Dobby has heard of your greatness, sir, but never has he been asked to sit down by a wizard. Like an equal.
You can't have met many decent wizards, then.
No, I haven't. It was an awful thing to say. Dobby!
Stop!
Dobby!
You notice that he uses the first-person pronoun when he slips, and then he says I, but not when he's referring to himself before that. So the master never has to punish the house elf, for the house elf has so internalized the master's authority that he always gets there first to punish himself. J.K. Rowling's imaginary world of wizarding stays in close contact with its medieval roots. One way it does this is by preserving among some wizards a belief in the importance of bloodlines, which are the basis of the lineage family. Of course, Rowling is a modern author, and so this belief is shown in a highly negative light as the prejudice of the Malfoys against mudbloods. Even the name Malfoy, which means bad faith, labels this belief as a form of evil. Still, Death Eaters do have some striking similarities to Shakespeare's Verona. So, from now on, we can speak of internalized punishment for rebellious thoughts, or we can simply refer to the Dobby principle. The patriarchal system, in its pure form, considers persons to be a kind of property. It treats human relationships, including family ties, in terms of ownership. Not all men are owners of such human property, but all the owners are men, and the dependents they own are either women and children or slaves. "An ye be mine," says Lord Capulet to Juliet, "I'll give you to my friend." When he talks this way, he is asserting a right of ownership, the right to dispose of his property as he wishes. I said this is true of patriarchy in its pure form, and that's an important qualification. Shakespeare's play doesn't hold Capulet up to us as an ideal. On the contrary, it asks us to sympathize with Juliet in this scene, and in the end it punishes the parents. But for all its sympathy with the children, there are moments when the play may seem to endorse the idea of women as property more uncritically. And today I'd like to take a closer look at this issue because property will be an important theme as we move on from Shakespeare to Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. We need to start by understanding that for Shakespeare's culture, the idea of human beings as property was not a simple question as it is for us today. Why wasn't it? For us, the ownership of human beings is slavery, pure and simple. It's evil. But in a patriarchal lineage society, human relationships are not seen in absolute contrast to property relations. On the contrary, human relationships, and especially family ties, are based on and defined by property relations. That probably sounds awful. It does sound awful. But if we want to understand human experience in times and places unlike our own, we need to combine imagination with curiosity in order to grasp what it was like to live in a world organized by such beliefs, a world in which the concepts of freedom, individualism, and human rights are not just alien, but inconceivable. Take, for example, the crime of rape. This crime offers a clear example of the difference it makes to define human relationships as forms of property. To us, this is obviously a crime against a person. In fact, it is one of the quintessential crimes against personhood. Its very essence is that it attacks the victim's body in the most intimate way in order to destroy her sense that she is a person. We see it in this way because our sense of what it means to be a person is anchored in the freedom to exercise control over our own bodies and personal space, especially in our most private moments. But for centuries, rape was understood in European law not as a crime against the person, but as a crime against property. A crime not primarily against the individual woman who was sexually assaulted, but against the family she belongs to. In order for rape to be recognized as a crime against the woman, it was first necessary for the woman to be recognized as the owner of her own body. Under patriarchy, most people were not, in fact, thought of as the owners of their bodies. The body of a wife belonged to her husband. The body of a dependent belonged to the father or the master of the household. The body of a subject belonged to the king. One of the great comic moments in Chaucer's Wife of Bath is her vigorous assertion of a reciprocal right of ownership over her husband. "He hath the power, during all my life," she proclaims, "upon his proper body, and not he." And identity is anchored where the body is owned. This is why dependents tend to identify with the master. For things to change, there had to be a tectonic shift in the understanding of the human body. But how does this happen? The value of individualism, which seems self-evident to us, could only emerge within the terms of the old system as a new concept of property, a concept that sees individuals as the owners of their own bodies. This change happened along with many of the changes in family structure that I spoke about earlier in these lectures. During the decades when Shakespeare wrote in England, this too was a change that had only just started happening and was by no means complete. Women then were not only or always property by any means, but they still were often defined that way. One of the symptoms of this is that even the language we use to talk about selfhood was not yet in place in the 16th century in England. Let's look at the way they used the words self and own. This is from Shakespeare's Macbeth. "By self and violent hands took off her life." Here self means by her own violent hands. It's an adjective, it's not a noun. And look at this. "All the power that this charm doth owe." Well, owe means the opposite of own, doesn't it? But in 16th century English, it meant the same thing. Women were not only or always property by any means, but they still were often defined that way. When they were recognized as persons, this recognition created a contradiction with their status as property. The status of women in Shakespeare's world is therefore deeply contradictory, and his plays explore this contradiction. To give you an example of how Romeo and Juliet explores this contradiction between the idea of women as persons and the idea of women as property, I want to focus on a single word. You'd be amazed at what a single word can reveal. That word is demean. It's an archaic form that for us has turned into the word domain. We can pick it up in the scene I just mentioned, where Capulet asserts his right of ownership over his dog. In the speech that begins at line 177 in Act 3, Scene 5, Capulet makes it clear that he's done what he understood to be his job as a father, namely to make a good match for his daughter. The result of all his hard work looks pretty good to him. A gentleman of noble parentage, of fair demeans, youthful and nobly lined, stuffed, as they say, with honorable parts, proportioned as one's thoughts would wish a man. Nobly lined makes him sound like a coat, but Capulet means lined as a synonym for descended, the same thing he means when he says Paris is of noble parentage. Clearly, this noble lineage stands out in his mind if it's so important that he repeats it. And yet the phrasing, nobly lined, stuffed, as they say, is unintentionally comical, as though Paris were some sort of upscale piñata, lined with silk and stuffed with honorable qualities. He has plenty of land, too. Demeans here means something like estates in the country. And he's not bad-looking either. He isn't even old, for Christ's sake, so what's not to like? How can Juliet be so unreasonable? This is one reason Capulet flies into a towering rage. He sincerely can't imagine why Juliet should disobey him. It's not that he doesn't love her. Look at all the effort he's put out for her benefit. It's that he is genuinely unable to comprehend her. If she tried to explain what she has done and why, he simply wouldn't understand. To him, marriage is about property, status, and power. Sure, you want good looks and intelligence to sweeten the deal, but by themselves they wouldn't count for much. Paris's property, his fair demeans, and Capulet's property, his fair daughter, are well matched. So what's the problem? Capulet is stumped. Next time we'll continue to follow this word's appearances in the play by taking a close look at Mercutio's speech at the start of Act 2.